New York City, the 11th of September 2001. A clear blue sky turns black with smoke. Sirens scream through the streets, news anchors stutter into microphones, and millions watch in disbelief as two planes vanish into steel and glass. The world pauses, and a single name burns across every screen: Osama bin Laden. He is called the mastermind, the ghost, the enemy of civilization. Yet decades earlier, he was merely a quiet, slender boy, born into opulence, the son of a billionaire builder, whose hands raised holy places across Islam's heartlands. How did a man born among marble palaces become the face of global terror? To answer that question, we must return to the desert, long before the towers fell, to the home of a child searching for purpose amid wealth and prayer. Osama bin Laden entered the world on the 10th of March 1957 in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, a nation awakening to the power of oil and faith. His father, Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, had immigrated from Yemen as a poor mason. Through shrewd ambition and relentless work, he rose to become the royal family's favored contractor. His company, the Saudi bin Laden Group, was no ordinary enterprise. It built and maintained Islam's most sacred sites, the Grand Mosque in Mecca, the Prophet's Mosque in Medina, and even restored the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. By the decade of 1960, the bin Laden name was synonymous with success, loyalty, and divine favor. The family's wealth stretched across continents, private jets, palaces, and partnerships with kings. Yet within those towering achievements, the seeds of distance were sown. Osama was one of more than 50 children from multiple mothers. His father was a man of faith and ferocity, often absent, always obeyed. He grew up surrounded by privilege but starved of intimacy. Even as his family's fortunes rose, he was a child lost among siblings, his heart turning not toward luxury but toward the only constant that made sense: God. In 1967, when Osama was just 10 years old, his father died in a plane crash near Jeddah. It was a cruel irony, a man who built airports for kings, perishing in his own aircraft. The shock rippled through Saudi Arabia, but for Osama it was personal, a spiritual rupture that would never heal. Without his father's shadow, Osama grew into a boy of restraint. Teachers described him as polite, disciplined, and devout. Yet there was a quiet sadness in him, an early gravitation toward absolutes. He lived with his mother and stepfather, Mohammed al-Attas, in Jeddah. Though the household was comfortable, Osama began to drift inward. He memorized verses of the Quran, rode horses alone, and found solace in solitude. The death that took his father planted a question that would echo through his life. If worldly success can vanish in a moment, what remains eternal? The year 1970 marked a time of upheaval across the Islamic world. Saudi Arabia was flooded with oil money, neon signs and Western cars filled streets once ruled by camels. Television brought American music into homes, and young Saudis embraced jeans and football. But Osama watched with unease. The more his nation modernized, the more he sensed spiritual decay. At King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, he studied economics, but his true education came after class in the private study circles of Islamic scholars. Among his mentors was Muhammad Qutb, brother of the Egyptian ideologue Sayyid Qutb, whose writings had become the intellectual foundation of modern jihadism. "The world of ignorance surrounds us," Qutb wrote. "The duty of every Muslim is to destroy it and rebuild it under God's law." Osama copied these words into his notebook. They struck him not as metaphor but as mission. He began to live simply, rejecting the luxury of his peers. Friends recalled a young man who prayed with intensity, spoke softly, and spent hours reading religious texts and poetry. He admired warriors from Islamic history, particularly those who had sacrificed comfort for belief. In his quiet conviction lay both purity and danger, a young man convinced that faith, if strong enough, could move mountains and empires. The heir of builders was now building something else entirely, an identity founded not on fortune, but on divine purpose. The year 1970 marked a time of upheaval across the Islamic world. Oil had made kingdoms rich but spiritually hollow. Monarchs built skyscrapers while the poor still prayed under tents. Colonial borders remained, carved by European hands decades earlier. And beneath this modern facade, a quiet rage grew, a sense that Islam had lost its unity, its dignity, its soul. Then came 1979, a year that would change everything. In Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini overthrew the Western-backed Shah and declared an Islamic republic, proof that religion could still topple empires. Months later, Soviet tanks rolled into Afghanistan, turning its valleys into a crucible of faith and fire. Across mosques and universities, one word began to echo: jihad. For Osama bin Laden, watching from Saudi Arabia, these events were not distant news, they were divine signs. God, he believed, was calling believers to rise. Inside his homeland, Osama saw the opposite of holiness. Saudi Arabia was drowning in luxury, Western engineers and lavish royal palaces. The same rulers who funded Islamic charities also drank quietly behind palace walls. The country's alliance with the United States, sealed by oil and arms, disgusted him. He saw it as a betrayal of Islam's independence, a trade of sacred soil for security guarantees. Religious authorities, bound to the monarchy, stayed silent. Osama's faith turned sharper, his world divided into two camps, those who obeyed God and those who served power. He began to view compromise itself as corruption. When the Afghan war erupted, Osama found his proving ground. Under the mentorship of Dr. Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian scholar who preached global jihad, he discovered both a teacher and a mission. Azzam's call was simple yet radical. Muslims everywhere must defend their brothers wherever they are attacked. To ignore injustice was to sin. For the restless heir from Jeddah, this message was oxygen. In 1980, Osama traveled to Pakistan, then onward to the Afghan border. At first, he was a financier, channeling his inheritance into supplies and construction, but his ambition soon grew. He helped establish Maktab al-Qidama, the Services Bureau, a network that recruited volunteers, funded camps, and funneled fighters into Afghanistan. By 1986, Osama was building tunnels, bunkers, and training compounds deep in the Hindu Kush. He watched Soviet helicopters fall from the sky and felt prophecy in every plume of smoke. The war baptized him in conviction. If faith could defeat the Soviet Union, it could defeat any empire. Out of that conviction came organization. In 1988, as the Soviets began to withdraw, Osama and a handful of veterans formed a new entity, Al-Qaeda, the base. It was more than a name, it was a worldview. The fight was no longer confined to Afghanistan. It was global, spiritual, eternal. When faith is absent, tyranny rises, Azzam had warned. Our duty is not comfort, it is struggle. Osama absorbed those words not as guidance but as law. The Soviet retreat in 1989 was celebrated across the Muslim world as divine victory. Crowds hailed the Mujahideen. Preachers declared that faith had humbled a superpower. But Osama saw something deeper, a strategy. He concluded that the same formula could bring down the West itself: belief, patience, and sacrifice. To him, the Cold War's end was not peace, it was a rehearsal. Returning to Saudi Arabia, he expected respect. Instead, he found indifference. The kingdom praised America for arming the Mujahideen, not the men who fought. His sense of betrayal deepened. He began to write essays, blending poetry and politics, warning that the next great battle would not be against the Soviets, but against the Americans who now filled their place. The idea took shape slowly. If the faithful could unite under one banner, one cause, they could redraw the world. He would be its architect. By the end of 1980, the boy who once memorized Quranic verses in a Jeddah classroom had become a commander in the mountains, a man who believed destiny itself had chosen him. The world was shifting toward globalization, capitalism, and communication. Osama bin Laden was preparing his answer, a network that would speak through destruction. In the summer of 1990, the Gulf heat shimmered with tension. Saddam Hussein's army had invaded Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia faced a sudden, terrifying question. Would Iraq invade next? Osama bin Laden believed he had the answer. He offered King Fahd a plan to use his network of Afghan war veterans, the Mujahideen, to defend the kingdom's borders. "We have men who have defeated a superpower," he insisted. "Let us defend the land of the Prophet." The king refused. Instead, he called upon the United States, inviting foreign troops into the Sacred Heart of Islam. For Osama, it was the ultimate betrayal. The holy land that held Mecca and Medina cities forbidden to non-Muslims was now filled with American soldiers. To him, this was not strategy, it was blasphemy. He begged the senior clerics, the ulama, to condemn the decision. They remained silent. His protests grew louder. "The land of the Prophet has been defiled by unbelievers," he declared in a public address. "Their presence is a humiliation to every Muslim." In 1991, his defiance reached its breaking point. Stripped of citizenship, exiled from his homeland, Osama bin Laden left Saudi Arabia. He would never return. The fracture between piety and power had now become irreversible, building the machine Al-Qaeda's global web. Bin Laden's exile led him to Sudan, where he was welcomed by Islamist leader Hassan al-Turabi and the regime of Omar al-Bashir. There, Osama transformed from fugitive into financier, from preacher into organizer. He bought land, built farms, and opened construction companies, legitimate fronts that masked his growing militant network. With wealth and vision, he turned Al-Qaeda into something the world had never seen, a decentralized movement, united by faith but spread across continents. The 11th of September 2001. The unthinkable becomes reality. 2 planes carve through New York's skyline, another tears into the Pentagon, a 4th crashes in Pennsylvania after passengers fight back. Within hours, the Twin Towers crumble into dust, and with them, the illusion of Western invincibility. In that instant, Osama bin Laden becomes both invisible and immortal, the most wanted man on earth, and the self-declared servant of God's vengeance. His face floods every television screen, his name repeated like a curse and a prophecy. Yet as the world watches in horror, he remains calm. From his hideouts in the Afghan mountains, he releases statements describing the attacks as divine justice. "What America tastes today is what we have tasted for decades," he says. To his followers, he is the lion of Islam. To the rest of humanity, he is its nightmare. Within weeks, the United States strikes back. Bombs rain over Afghanistan. The Taliban government collapses, its leaders fleeing south as American and allied forces close in. In the caves of Tora Bora, bin Laden narrowly escapes, slipping through the mountains into Pakistan. The war he wanted has begun, and it will not end for 20 years. Afghanistan is invaded. Iraq follows in 2003. The United States spends trillions, toppling governments and chasing ghosts. Thousands die in Baghdad, Kabul, Kandahar, cities that few in the West had ever heard of before 9/11. Bin Laden's strategy of attrition unfolds exactly as he envisioned. Drain the enemy economically, morally, spiritually. "We will bleed them until they collapse from within," he told his followers. But his own empire begins to crumble. The decentralized Al-Qaeda network splinters. In Iraq, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi forms a new branch so brutal that even bin Laden condemns its savagery. That faction evolves into ISIS, which soon eclipses its founder's legacy in both violence and notoriety. By the late 2000s, Osama bin Laden is no longer leading revolutions, he is hiding from them. For nearly a decade, he moves between safe houses in northern Pakistan, eventually settling in the quiet military town of Abbottabad. There, behind high walls and barbed wire, he lives a life of eerie simplicity, reading the Quran, watching old videos of himself, teaching his children. Outside, his image still fuels movements across continents. Inside, he is a prisoner of his own legend. On the 2nd of May 2011, the legend ends. 2 U.S. stealth helicopters descend silently over Abbottabad. Operation Neptune Spear begins. Within 40 minutes, it is over. Bin Laden is found on the 3rd floor of his compound, unarmed. He is shot twice, once in the chest, once above the left eye. His body is flown out under the cover of darkness and buried at sea, weighted with iron chains. There is no grave, no shrine, no monument, only the ocean, and a sense of unfinished reckoning. President Barack Obama addresses the world. Justice has been done. But justice, like faith, is never that simple. The towers have been rebuilt. The wars he ignited still smolder. Osama bin Laden's dream of a united Islamic caliphate never materialized. His call for holy war left nations fractured and faith mistrusted. Yet the echo of his name lingers in airport security lines, in refugee camps, in the fear that still shapes global politics. He began as the son of a builder and ended as the destroyer of worlds. Between those silences lies a truth both terrifying and human. Belief, when stripped of compassion, becomes a weapon sharper than any blade. He was born to build, one journalist wrote after his death, but he chose to burn. Osama bin Laden proved that one man's conviction can move mountains, tear nations apart, and still fail to save his own soul. In the end, he built nothing lasting, only lessons. Sudan became a laboratory for jihad. Engineers, clerics, and veterans gathered to discuss theology and tactics. Training camps dotted the outskirts of Khartoum, preparing recruits from across the Arab world. Al-Qaeda's structure was fluid, no single headquarters, no borders, only believers connected by ideology and satellite phones. To his followers, Osama was no longer just a leader, he was a symbol. By around 1995. The world began to notice. Western intelligence reports linked him to terrorist plots in Yemen, Egypt, and Somalia. The U.S. pressed Sudan to expel him. Under rising pressure, he packed his network and once again disappeared east, returning to Afghanistan, now ruled by a new fundamentalist movement, the Taliban. Public theater, propaganda, and performance. In the caves and compounds of Kandahar, Osama perfected a new kind of warfare, one waged not only with bombs but with imagery. He invited journalists to his hideouts, granting interviews filmed by lantern light. His calm voice contrasted with the violence of his message. "America has declared war on God," he said softly. "We will defend our faith." He understood media psychology. Each statement was timed for impact, each attack accompanied by a message. When American missiles struck his camps after the 1998 U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, he turned the strikes into propaganda victories. The world's most powerful nation, he claimed, feared a man hiding in caves. Television, not theology, became his amplifier. Every explosion was a sermon, every image of fire, a call to arms. Terrorism had found its stage. No return, the Great Strike. By the late 1992, Al-Qaeda had become an invisible empire. Cells operated in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Europe, and even the United States. Its members used couriers instead of phones, charities instead of banks. In February 1998, Osama issued a fatwa titled Declaration of Jihad Against the Jews and Crusaders. Killing the Americans and their allies, civilians, and military is an individual duty for every Muslim, it proclaimed. It was an open declaration of war. What followed was a slow, deliberate orchestration of terror. Al-Qaeda agents studied Western aviation, security patterns, and media response. Bin Laden's inner circle, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Mohammed Atta, Ayman al-Zawahiri refined a plan that was both symbolic and apocalyptic, to strike the heart of American power with its own instruments. On the 11th of September 2001, the plan unfolded with terrifying precision. 19 hijackers, 4 planes, 2 hours, nearly 3,000 dead. The world watched, paralyzed. Bin Laden, somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, watched too. To him, it was the moment destiny had promised. But in claiming victory, he sealed his own fate. The student had become the engineer of fear. The builder's son had turned his father's empire of construction into an empire of destruction. And now, with the world in flames, he believed the divine tide had finally turned in his favor. But empires, even those of terror, do not last forever.